Have you ever noticed how sometimes the highest compliment you can get is actually a trap?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Like, think about being called strong. You've probably given that compliment to someone, right?
Right. Or received it. It's so common.
Exactly. You look at someone who has just been through absolute hell, someone carrying this impossible burden, and you tell them, you are so strong.
And it feels supportive. It feels like you're validating them.
It really does. It feels like an acknowledgement of their resilience. But if you take a step back and really look at the mechanics of that compliment in certain historical contexts, you start to realize something deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
Calling someone strong can actually be the exact mechanism society uses to justify never offering them any help.
Right, because it creates a psychological permission structure.
A permission structure. Tell me more about that.
Well, if society labels a specific group of people as, inherently resilient or practically superhuman, then society no longer has to feel guilty about the weight that group is forced to carry.
Oh, wow.
The logic just becomes, well, they can handle it, so we don't have to change the conditions that are crushing them. It takes a survival response and twists it into a biological expectation.
That is so twisted, and that twisted expectation is exactly where we are heading today. We are doing a deep dive into the historical evidence and sociological frameworks laid out by the brilliant and often provocative feminist theorist Bell Hooks.
Yes, her work is just monumental.
It really is. If you've seen the Ain't I a Woman video episode, consider this your audio companion. We aren't doing a quick summary today.
No, we are slowing way down.
Exactly. We're pulling out a towering stack of Hooks texts, primarily her groundbreaking 1981 book, Ain't I a Woman, but we're also pulling vital threads from Sisters of the Yam, Teaching to Transgress, and Feminist Theory, from margin to center.
Which is a lot of ground to cover, but it's so necessary.
It is. We want to close read the argument she constructs about how Black women in America have been duly victimized by both racism and sexism, and, in a way that is entirely unique to their specific intersection.
Right. And the foundational argument Hooks makes across all these texts is that Black women were systematically denied the protections of what American society deemed womanhood.
Stretching all the way back to the plantation.
All the way back. We are going to look at the economic ledgers of slavery, the betrayals within the women's suffrage movement, the patriarchal demands of the civil rights movement, and ultimately how the very language we use to describe social justice has historically been coded.
Coded to erase Black women entirely.
Exactly.
Before we jump into those texts, I want to lay down our mission for you, the listener. We are stepping into an arena that is heavily debated and, frankly, intensely politically charged.
Very much so. Bell Hooks pulls absolutely no punches.
None. She offers blistering critiques of the history of white supremacy, sexual violence, and systemic racism, but she is equally critical of left-leaning social movements.
Right. She takes aim at mainstream white feminism just as fiercely as the Black male leaders of the civil rights movement.
Yeah. So our goal today is not to endorse a specific political platform or take a side or tell you what to believe.
No, our job is to impartially unpack the arguments exactly as Hooks laid them out in her work.
We want to give you the deep structural context necessary to understand how she views the architecture of American society. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
And to do that, we actually have to start with the dictionary. We have to look at the foundational language of social movements.
Because language is where the erasure begins, right?
Yeah.
Language dictates the boundaries of our reality.
It really does.
One of the most piercing observations Hooks makes in her analysis of historical literature and political rhetoric is this subtle but devastating linguistic pattern.
Subtle but devastating is the perfect way to put it.
When you read the primary source documents of the 19th and 20th centuries, and honestly even much of the discourse today, the word women is almost exclusively used to mean white women.
Right.
Conversely, when the texts refer to blacks, they almost exclusively mean Black men.
Which effectively erases Black women from the linguistic equation entirely.
Completely erases them.
It's like looking at a Venn diagram of two massive demographic groups, but the entire overlapping middle section has just been covered in whiteout.
Yes, that is exactly what it is.
You see this mechanism operating in plain sight when you look at the historical analogies that white feminists relied upon. In Ain't I a Woman, Hooks points out how frequently white women's rights advocates would build their platform by comparing their plight to the plight of enslaved Black people.
Right, using rhetoric like, women are the slaves of society.
Or marriage is the equivalent of a plantation.
Which is an analogy that collapses the very moment you apply basic logic to it.
Completely.
Think about the mechanical function of an analogy. You are drawing a comparison between two completely disparate, separate entities to highlight a shared characteristic.
You're saying Group A experiences something similar to Group B.
Exactly. But if Group A and Group B overlap, meaning if millions of people belong to both groups simultaneously, the analogy is intellectually bankrupt.
It makes absolutely zero sense.
You cannot compare women and slaves as if they are separate silos of human experience, because black women existed. Millions of them were both women and enslaved.
So, by clinging to that metaphor, white feminists were implicitly stating that the category of woman did not include black women.
Right. It was a deliberate rhetorical choice.
A choice that made woman completely synonymous with white woman. Like, if a black woman is standing in the room, you cannot look at her and say, my life as a woman is just like the life of a slave.
Right, because she is the living embodiment of the flaw in your argument.
Yeah, so the language of the movement just wrote her out of the script.
And that linguistic erasure has compounding consequences. If the language of your society does not possess a distinct framework for your specific identity, then society is incapable of addressing your specific oppression.
Wow. If you don't have the words, you can't solve the problem.
Exactly. If all conversations about sexism center on white women, and all conversations about racism center on black men, the black woman falls through the cracks of both movements.
She is told her issues are secondary.
Or that they will be, magically resolved if just one of those other groups achieves liberation.
I want to push back on this concept of erasure just a bit, though, to make sure we are exploring every angle Hooks provides.
Sure.
Because while she argues they were erased from the political language, the texts also show that society definitely had words to describe black women.
Yes, they did.
And the most enduring description, the one that survives today, is that concept of the strong black woman. We mentioned this at the top of the deep dive.
Right, the stereotype of the fiercely independent, unbreakable matriarch.
Yeah. You hear it in popular culture, you see it in media. It sounds, on its surface, like reverence, like a compliment.
It does sound like a compliment.
So how does Hooks reconcile the idea that society views black women as uniquely powerful with her argument that this is actually a mechanism of profound marginalization?
That paradox is central to Hooks's critique in Sisters of the Am. The reverence is a smokescreen.
A smokescreen?
Yeah. Romanticizing the endurance of a marginalized group is a psychological defense mechanism employed by the dominant culture.
Okay, break that down for us.
When society culturally enforces the idea that black women are innately strong, superhuman, or capable of bearing infinite amounts of stress and trauma, it fundamentally alters the social contract.
Because if you are superhuman, you don't require human empathy.
Exactly. You don't need systemic intervention. You don't need protection.
And you certainly don't need resources.
The trauma of being forced to endure horrific, crushing conditions is conveniently rebranded as an inherent character trait. It masks the pain.
That is so dark, but so clear.
By celebrating their strength, society is effectively communicating, we are absolved from caring about your suffering because you are biologically and emotionally built to handle it.
The compliment weaponizes their survival against them.
It turns their resilience into an excuse for systemic neglect.
I think we need to let that settle for a moment. Just the idea that acknowledging someone's strength can be the very tool you use to abandon them.
Yeah, it's heavy.
Let's just sit with that for a second.
Take your time.
To understand how that superhuman myth was forged, we have to look at the economic ledgers of the 19th century. Hooks takes us into the crucible of the American plantation system.
Because this is where the definition of womanhood was intentionally and violently restricted based on race.
Let's talk about the economics first.
Well, the plantation economy was entirely dependent on maximizing physical output. The white enslavers needed arduous, brutal, backbreaking labor from every human being they claimed as property.
Right.
However, this economic imperative was on a direct collision course with the prevailing social ideology of the era.
The Victorian ideals, right.
Yes. The 19th century was defined by strict patriarchal myths about female biology. The prevailing science and social consensus insisted that women were physically inferior, inherently frail, emotionally delicate.
Constitutionally unsuited for anything outside the domestic sphere.
Exactly. So the white enslavers faced with a massive cognitive dissonance.
Right. On one hand, he believes women are fragile creatures incapable of hard labor. On the other hand, he is forcing enslaved black women to chop wood, plow fields, haul heavy loads.
And endure the exact same grueling physical punishments as the men.
So how does the enslaver justify forcing a woman to do the labor he has just declared women are biologically incapable of doing?
The only way to resolve that contradiction without dismantling the entire patriarchal view of women is to strip the enslaved black female of her gender identity.
Oh, wow. Just strip it away entirely.
The logic dictates if a true woman cannot survive this labor, and this person is surviving this labor, then this person must not be a true woman.
So white society engineered a strict, uncompromising dichotomy of gender.
They created an ideological quarantine.
An ideological quarantine, that concept is so critical here.
It really is. The white woman was elevated to the status of Victorian goddess. She was placed on a pedestal of extreme purity, fragility, and moral virtue.
She was the spiritual center of the home.
Right. But you cannot maintain a pedestal of absolute purity unless you have a repository for all the impurity.
That is such a crucial point. The white patriarchy was incredibly repressive. White men needed a psychological and physical space to place all of their base, violent, and aggressive sexual desires.
Without contaminating the supposed sanctity of the white domestic sphere.
Exactly. So they took all of those repressed, taboo attributes and violently projected them onto the bodies of enslaved black women.
And this projection is the origin of the pernicious Jezebel myth.
Right.
To protect the illusion of the white woman's pristine virtue, the black woman had to be cast as the absolute opposite: sexually aggressive, subhuman, inherently immoral, and animalistic.
They were labeled as sexual temptresses, and Hooks goes into horrifying detail about the functional reality of that myth.
Yes, she does.
This wasn't just a matter of name-calling, it was the absolute commodification of human reproduction. The texts lay out the brutal mechanics of slave breeding.
It's some of the hardest reading in the texts, honestly.
It really is. White enslavers realized that the easiest way to amass wealth wasn't just through agricultural labor, but through the biological reproduction of their workforce.
The sources detail how women were treated literally like livestock.
They were offered trivial, degrading rewards like a pig or a cheap dress for bearing a certain number of children.
Children who would immediately become the enslaver's property.
Yeah, and the flip side of that commodification was the punishment for barrenness. If an enslaved woman could not conceive, if she couldn't add to the master's capital, she was subjected to severe physical and psychological torture.
She was reduced entirely to her biological utility, completely unprotected by any law, public opinion, or basic standard of human decency.
What I find so chilling in Hooks's analysis is the psychological gymnastics of the oppressors here.
Oh, the rationalizations are staggering.
White men constructed a framework where they were committing mass sexual violence, rape, forced breeding, routine torture, but because they had classified the black woman as a sexually savage Jezebel, they claimed that they were the victims.
Right. What's fascinating here is how the enslavers claimed they were simply falling prey to the inherent wickedness and temptation of the enslaved woman.
It's victim blaming on an industrial scale.
They even twisted religious doctrines to support this inversion of reality, framing the black woman as the embodiment of ancient biblical evil that caused righteous white men to stray.
It was a perfectly sealed, self-justifying system. It allowed the most brutal acts of sexism and racism to be sanctioned by the state and the church.
And this is the root of Hooks's argument about dual victimization.
Explain that connection.
Well, the enslaved black woman wasn't just oppressed as a black person forced into labor. She was specifically oppressed as a female body, uniquely exploited for her reproductive capacity, while simultaneously being denied any of the social protections that society afforded to the concept of woman.
That complete dehumanization in the fields and the breeding cabins didn't just stay outside, though. It permeated the actual house, right up to the front parlor.
It did. The domestic sphere was deeply infected by this.
If you are examining this dynamic purely through the lens of gender, you might reasonably assume that the white mistress of the plantation and the enslaved black woman might have found some shred of shared empathy.
Right, because both are living under a patriarchal system that severely limits their rights.
You'd think the shared vulnerability to male power, the shared biological realities of womanhood would spark some kind of clandestine solidarity. But Hooks argues forcefully, especially in Teaching to Transgress and Ain't I a Woman, that this sisterhood was entirely and aggressively denied.
Completely denied. The historical record Hooks dismantles any romanticized notion of cross-racial sisterhood on the plantation.
White women were deeply and actively complicit in the devaluation of black women.
When faced with the reality of their husbands committing rampant sexual violence, or the horrific tragedy of black mothers having their children ripped from their arms and sold downriver, white women did not act as allies.
They frequently turned a blind eye.
Or, in many documented cases, they actively participated in the brutality, enacting severe physical punishments on enslaved women out of jealousy or displaced rage.
I always try to put myself in the shoes of the people in these historical scenarios to understand the systemic pressure. Why direct the anger at the victim?
Right? Why not aim at the person actually in power?
The white woman knows her husband holds all the legal and physical power. The enslaved woman cannot consent. Why does the white mistress aim her wrath downward at the enslaved woman rather than upward at the patriarchal power structure?
It comes down to the precarious nature of the white woman's own power. Within the cultural setting of the 19th century, a white woman had practically no independent agency.
None.
Her entire economic security, her social standing, her very survival was completely dependent on her relationship to white men.
So if she attacks the patriarchal structure, she attacks her only source of provision.
Exactly. When white men were coercively engaging in sexual relationships with enslaved black women, the white mistress didn't view it through a lens of human rights or shared trauma.
She viewed it through the lens of the sexual marketplace.
She saw a competitor.
That eliminates a really tragic truth about how systemic power operates, which is a pattern you can see repeated throughout history.
It's a very common, grim pattern.
When a system oppresses you, as the patriarchy oppressed white women, the most courageous thing to do is dismantle the hierarchy. But the safest, easiest thing to do is align yourself with the oppressor against someone lower on the ladder.
That's spot on. White women chose the shield of white supremacy to compensate for their absolute lack of power under sexism.
The racial dominance they were allowed to exercise over black people mediated the sting of the sexism they experienced from white men.
They sacrificed solidarity to maintain their fragile position on the pedestal.
And to protect that position, white women needed strict social taboos to keep black women dehumanized.
Right. Acknowledging the humanity or the victimization of the black woman would threaten the entire racial hierarchy that gave the white woman her only shred of societal privilege.
Just a tragic absence of solidarity. And that instinct, protecting the pedestal at the cost of solidarity, didn't just vanish when the Civil War ended.
No, it evolved.
Let's move the timeline forward. Slavery ends, and the push for women's suffrage begins. That dynamic became the exact blueprint for how white women organized the suffrage movement decades later.
We often get a very sanitized version of history here.
We really do. Where the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement are presented as this unified, glorious march toward progress, led by figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony.
But Hooks provides a fierce critique of these icons. She lays out the evidence that the leaders of the white women's rights movement were deeply committed to maintaining white supremacy.
The divergence between abolition and women's rights is a critical historical intervention Hooks makes. While many white women in the North opposed the institution of slavery on moral or religious grounds, opposing slavery did not equate to believing in social or political equality for black people.
Right. And this ideological fault line violently ruptured over the issue of the vote in the aftermath of the Civil War.
As the 15th Amendment was being debated, it became clear that the political winds might favor granting black men the right to vote before extending the franchise to white women.
And the reaction from the leaders of the white suffragist movement wasn't just disappointment about the timeline of progress.
No, it was virulent, deeply racist outrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is immortalized as a champion of equality, was furious.
Hooks quotes her expressing deep offense that, and this is a quote, Saxon men would allow Africans to legislate over them.
Wait, she actually said Saxon men and Africans?
Yes, that is the exact language she used.
Wow, that is jarring to hear.
It tells you everything you need to know about her ideological priorities at that moment. The primary grievance of the white suffragist leadership wasn't that sexism was unjustly keeping competent women from the ballot box.
Their core grievance was that their supposedly superior racial status wasn't enough to override their gender.
Exactly. They felt insulted that American society would elevate a black man whom they firmly viewed as racially inferior above a white woman.
They weren't fighting to abolish the hierarchy. They were fighting for their rightful place near the top of it.
Exactly. They appealed directly and shamelessly to white men's racism. The suffragists argued that enfranchising educated, native-born white women was a necessary political maneuver.
A maneuver to protect the institution of white supremacy from the political influence of newly enfranchised black voters and immigrants.
Yes.
And this wasn't just a rhetorical strategy used in debates. It dictated the structural reality of the women's movement for decades. The sources detail how the massive white women's club movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries actively and explicitly excluded black women.
Hooks highlights the story of Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, a brilliant black journalist, activist, and leader.
What happened with her?
She attempted to integrate these National Women's Club conventions, but white women vehemently refused to associate with her or their organizations.
And the justification goes right back to the plantation myth we were just discussing.
It does. The psychological conditioning of slavery proved incredibly durable. Even in a movement explicitly dedicated to the moral and political elevation of women, white women viewed black women as a contamination risk to their purity and social standing.
The racist myth of black female immorality and licentiousness was still fully operational.
So, black women were completely marooned. They were forced to form their own parallel organization.
They built their own clubs to fight for basic human dignity, pushing for anti-lynching legislation, funding education, and fighting poverty.
All while the mainstream white feminist movement focused narrowly on gaining entrance into the existing white patriarchal power structure.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The hypocrisy becomes even more pronounced when Hooks traces this dynamic into the modern era. She points out that the appropriation of black suffering didn't stop in the 1920s.
Not at all. During the second waves of feminism in the 1960s and 70s, modern white feminists continued to hijack the horrors of the black experience to give their own movement moral gravity.
This is one of the most jarring sections of the reading for me. You have middle-class white women in the suburbs using incredibly extreme language to describe the boredom and lack of fulfillment in their domestic lives.
They would compare the role of the housewife to being a slave, or even use racial slurs to describe their social standing.
Explicitly trying to shock the American public into caring about their lack of career opportunities. They wanted to tap into the visceral moral outrage that the civil rights movement had generated.
But while they eagerly appropriated the language and the metaphors of black suffering to legitimize their own cause, they simultaneously ignored the actual living, breathing black women who were in their ranks.
Many of those white feminists were relying on the underpaid domestic labor of black women just to free up their own time to go to protests and consciousness-raising groups.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They wanted the moral authority of being the ultimate victim, which the black experience represented in the American consciousness, but they had no interest in addressing the reality of black women's lives.
Doing so would require those white women to acknowledge their own complicity in systemic racism and class exploitation.
Right. It is significantly easier to use a marginalized group as a rhetorical metaphor than it is to sit at a table, listen to their demands, and actually share political power with them.
If the women's movement sidelined black women by centering whiteness, how did the movements for black liberation handle gender? Let's look in the civil rights and black power movements of the mid-20th century.
Hooks applies the same rigorous, unflinching critique to the black liberation movements. She methodically unpacks the pervasive sexism that ran through the leadership structures of these organizations.
During the 50s and 60s, as black Americans were fighting a life-or-death struggle to dismantle Jim Crow and gain entrance into the mainstream of American economic and political life, black male leaders faced a strategic dilemma.
They did. They often concluded that the most viable path to gaining respect and equality in a white-dominated society was to mimic white patriarchal structures.
The theory was essentially assimilation through traditional gender roles. To be viewed as legitimate, respectable citizens by the white establishment, black men felt they needed to present a traditional patriarchal family dynamic.
Right. A man is the undisputed head of the household, the primary breadwinner, and political voice.
And the woman is subordinate, supportive, and confined to the domestic sphere.
Because black men were systematically stripped of political and economic power in the public sphere, asserting absolute dominance in the domestic sphere became a primary avenue for claiming manhood.
Tragically, sexism became a point of intersection, a shared language and a shared value system between white men and black men.
As Hooks notes in her analysis, white men may have harbored deep racial hatred for black men, but they inherently understood and respected the black man's assertion of patriarchal authority over women.
It was a language of domination they both spoke. The result of this was that black women, who were often the primary organizers, strategists, and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement, were frequently pushed to the background when the camera started rolling.
They were told to be submissive, to let the men lead the marches and give the speeches.
Bringing up women's rights or gender equality was actively discouraged because it was viewed as divisive to the race.
The prevailing attitude was, we have to solve racism first, and we can't afford to dilute our political capital by talking about sexism.
This internal marginalization made black women incredibly vulnerable to external sociological attacks, which brings us to one of the most damaging pieces of public policy rhetoric discussed in the texts: the matriarch myth.
The Moynihan Report.
Yes, in 1965, the government published the Moynihan Report, a sociological study intended to analyze the roots of poverty in black communities.
And the report essentially blamed the economic and social struggles of the black family on this supposedly overbearing, dominant role of black women.
Let's break down how this sociological weapon actually functioned, because the framing is incredibly insidious. Historically, because black men were systematically denied living wages, shut out of unions, and subjected to mass incarceration, black women were forced to work outside the home in massive numbers just to ensure their families didn't starve.
They were working grueling hours as domestics, cooks, and washerwomen.
The authors of the Moynihan Report looked at this economic reality, a reality engineered by white supremacy, and labeled these working black women as matriarchs.
They claim these women were emasculating black men, driving them away, and causing the sociological downfall of their own communities.
It is a devastating, almost pathological misrepresentation of reality. If you look at the sociological definition of a true matriarchy, it implies that women hold the centralized social, political, and economic power in a society.
Which was completely untrue for black women in America. At the time of that report and historically, they were at the absolute bottom of the American economic ladder.
They held zero institutional power. They were working for poverty wages under exploitative conditions.
To look at a population of women who are economically disenfranchised and politically marginalized and label them a matriarchy is just a cruel joke.
It's a classic misdirection. The white patriarchal power structure shifts the blame for the devastating effects of redlining, employment discrimination, and systemic racism away from its own policies.
And drops it squarely onto the shoulders of the black women who are just trying to keep their families alive.
But didn't some black women embrace the term matriarch? Doesn't it sound powerful? Like if you are constantly told you are marginalized and suddenly an official government report or a cultural narrative tells you that you are actually the strong, central, powerful pillar holding everything together, I can see the allure.
Sure, out of context, the word sounds like a title of immense respect. But Hooks addresses this directly and warns against the allure of that title.
She calls it a trap, right?
She clarifies that embracing the matriarch label was a colonizing trick. By convincing black women that they already possessed this immense outsized power within their families, the dominant culture gave them a completely false sense of privilege.
The logic being, why would you fight for power if you've been convinced you already have it?
Precisely. If you believe you are already a powerful, commanding matriarch, you are far less likely to organize collectively to fight the very real economic exploitation and sexism that is actually crushing you.
It pacifies resistance.
It prevents you from seeing that your so-called power is actually just the suffocating burden of uncompensated, unsupported labor.
Believing in the matriarchy myth alienated black women from recognizing their true status at the bottom of the hierarchy, which was the necessary first step to sparking a genuine targeted movement for their own liberation.
Yeah, you can't fight a system if you're under the illusion that you're running it.
We've covered a landscape of incredibly heavy, infuriating history today. We've looked at the linguistic erasure that removed them from the text, the violence of the plantation that denied their gender, the betrayals by white suffragists who chose race over sisterhood, and the sexism of a civil rights era that demanded female submission in the name of racial unity.
It's a dense web of interlocking oppressions.
But Hooks doesn't just leave her readers stranded in the trauma. She is fundamentally a theorist of liberation. So when you are trapped in this historical vice grip, erased by language, demonized by society, sidelined by your own movements, how do you actually survive? And more importantly, how do you recover?
For Hooks, the path to self-recovery requires a clear-eyed, unflinching recognition of this intense interlocking system.
You cannot heal a wound if you refuse to acknowledge the weapon that caused it.
Exactly. Drawing from Sisters of the Ammon Loves the Practice of Freedom, she explains that emotional health is not just a personal issue, it is deeply political.
She brings up this concept of dissimulation, which I think is one of the most profound psychological frameworks in the reading.
Dissimulation is basically the art of hiding behind a false appearance.
It was a vital survival tactic developed during slavery. Enslaved folks had to constantly lie, hide their true feelings, mask their intelligence, and swallow their anger to survive the daily brutality of white supremacy.
You couldn't show the enslaver your true self, your true grief, or your true brilliance, because it could literally cost you your life.
It brings to mind the famous poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, "We wear the mask that grins and lies."
Yes. It was a necessary tool for physical survival in a state of violent racial apartheid. But Hooks argues that this survival tactic, which has been passed down through generations, has become deeply toxic in the modern era.
How so?
Well, when you are conditioned to constantly second-guess how the dominant culture will perceive you, when you are constantly altering your behavior, your speech, and your emotional expression to seem non-threatening.
Or to project that flawless image of the strong black woman who has everything under control.
Right. You eventually lose touch with your authentic self. It forces black women to live in a state of denial, pretending everything is fine while carrying immense stress and trauma.
Hooks points out the physical toll of this, too. We see it today in modern healthcare disparities. The chronic stress of living a double life, of constantly wearing the mask, manifests as weathering.
High blood pressure, autoimmune diseases, mental health crises, and sheer physical exhaustion.
The survival strategies that once kept people alive are now killing them slowly. The mask has become a suffocating weight.
Therefore, Hooks posits that healing requires a radical, uncompromising commitment to truth-telling.
Speaking the truth about one's life, naming the pain, acknowledging the vulnerability, and breaking down the fortified wall between the public facade and private suffering.
Yes. As Hooks notes, choosing wellness in a society that relies on your exploitation is an act of political resistance.
By deciding to be well, by deciding to be whole and vulnerable, you are actively defying a culture of domination that expects you to be broken and silent.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this truth-telling leads directly to the ultimate framework Hooks proposes, which she calls her ethic of love.
Tell us about the ethic of love.
She argues that moving away from systems of domination isn't just about changing the demographics of who sits at the top of the pyramid. If we just flip the hierarchy, but maintain the mechanics of oppression, we are still living in a dominator culture.
Right, if you just replace the oppressor but keep the system of exploitation intact, nothing has fundamentally changed. The machinery is just being operated by different hands.
True transformation requires an entirely new machinery, powered by an ethic of love. This means extending ourselves for the spiritual and physical growth of others, committing to service, and cultivating genuine radical compassion.
Pushing for true reconciliation, right?
Yes, it's about recognizing the profound, inescapable interrelatedness of all people. Hooks aligns here with visionaries like Martin Luther King Jr., who didn't just want black people to win a political victory over white people.
He wanted to create a beloved community.
Exactly, a beloved community where everyone is liberated from the spiritual death that oppression causes. Hooks argues that the moment we choose to love not as a passive romantic feeling, but as a deep political communal action that demands justice and truth, we begin to actively dismantle the very foundations of systemic domination.
We've covered a massive expanse of territory today. We started by examining the quiet violence of linguistic erasure, how the very words we use hid black women from the historical record.
We walked through the brutal economic crucible of the plantation, where the concept of womanhood was weaponized and violently denied.
We saw the tragic betrayals of the 19th and 20th centuries, how white suffragists sacrificed sisterhood to protect their racial dominance, and how the civil rights era demanded female submission to appease a patriarchal standard.
And finally, we arrived at Hooks's radical proposition for self-recovery, taking off the mask, rejecting the myth of superhuman strength, and telling the truth as a form of political defiance.
To you, listening right now, whether you are prepping for a sociology class, trying to understand the roots of modern political discourse, or just deeply curious about the hidden currents of American history, the vital takeaway here is about how we perceive reality.
Absolutely.
Being well-informed isn't just about memorizing the dates of the 15th Amendment or the names of specific sociological reports. True learning is about understanding how the invisible architecture of language and the historical myths we've internalized shape the very world we walk through today.
It's about seeing the overlapping, intersecting systems that construct our society so we can finally start to untangle them.
As we close our deep dive today, I want to offer a final thought that builds on everything we've discussed.
If society has spent centuries coding strength as a way to ignore someone's pain, what does it truly look like to offer a space of gentleness and vulnerability to those who have historically been denied it?
Because true solidarity isn't just fighting alongside someone in a political struggle. It's allowing them the space to simply be human, to be exhausted, to be vulnerable, without ever demanding that they be strong.
I think that's a perfect place to end.
We have one final question for you to sit with as you go about the rest of your day. Think about the history of dissimulation we discussed, the exhausting weight of the public facade, and think about the spaces you navigate in your own life. If your survival relies on wearing a mask, who do you become when it's finally safe enough to take it off? Thank you for listening to the Graduated Thought podcast.
Hey there, glad you stopped by. If you're feeling the vibe, stick around for a little while. Don't forget to like and subscribe, like and subscribe.